They say you never truly know how much your family values you till you're forced to see where you rank in their priorities. My name is Michael Carter. I'm 42 years old, and for the past 2 years, I've been raising my 11-year-old twins, Lucas and Grace, on my own. After my marriage to Emily ended, I thought moving into my parents' home, Thomas and Linda Carter, in Charleston, South Carolina, would be a blessing. Just until you get back on your feet, my dad promised. It felt like a safety net during one of the darkest chapters of my life. But my family history has always been complicated. I was the steady, dependable one, the kid who followed the rules, put myself through nursing school, and worked long shifts in the ER. My younger brother, Ryan Carter, was different. Charismatic, adventurous, and always landing on his feet, even when our parents had to pull him out of trouble. They never said it out loud, but Ryan was the golden child, and I was the one who would be fine on his own. For a while, things were manageable. Lucas and Grace had a cozy, converted office as their bedroom. I contributed to groceries and chores, and my parents helped with school drop-offs when I worked late. We had a rhythm. Not perfect, but it worked. That all changed the day Ryan and his wife, Tiffany, welcomed their baby boy, Owen. And from that moment on, my children slowly began to disappear from their grandparents' world. From the time we were kids, there had always been an invisible measuring stick in our house, one that tilted heavily in my brother Ryan's favor. I can still remember being 12 years old, bringing home a Strata report card, and hearing my dad nod politely before asking if I'd mowed the lawn. A week later, Ryan came home with a most improved ribbon from his middle school soccer team. And you'd think he'd just been drafted into the NFL. It wasn't that my parents didn't care about me. It's just, they assumed I'd be fine. I was steady. The one they didn't have to worry about. I followed the rules, picked up extra shifts at the grocery store in high school to help pay for my own clothes, and put myself through nursing school 1 credit hour at a time. Ryan, on the other hand, was the wild card. He'd rack up parking tickets, forget deadlines, and shrug his way through responsibilities. But my parents, Thomas and Linda, always found a way to excuse it. He's just figuring things out, Mom would say. Or, Ryan's got such potential, we can't let him waste it. When he dropped out of college after a semester, they poured tens of thousands into helping him start a real estate business. And when that finally took off, it was as if every risky decision he'd ever made had been proof of some visionary spirit only they could see. By the time my marriage, too, Emily unraveled. That pattern of favoritism wasn't even on my radar anymore. It was so baked into our family dynamic, I didn't notice it unless it slapped me in the face, and moving in with my parents after the divorce. I thought we'd all settled into a fair, if imperfect, arrangement. Lucas and Grace shared the converted home office, which we turned into a cheerful bedroom with matching twin beds and shelves for their books. I took the small guest room, paid for our own groceries, did most of the cooking, and kept up my share of cleaning. My parents helped with school drop-offs and pickups when my 12-hour shifts ran late. We had a rhythm. And then Ryan and Tiffany had Owen. I'll admit it, Owen's a cute kid. Big brown eyes, chubby cheeks, the kind of baby who makes strangers smile in the grocery store aisle. But the way my parents reacted was like someone had flipped a switch. Overnight, they became doting grandparents in a way I'd never seen before, and certainly not toward Lucas and Grace. They transformed the formal dining room into a grandbaby sweet crib. Changing table, rocking chair despite Ryan and Tiffany owning a 4-bedroom home 10 minutes away. High-end strollers, organic cotton swaddles, toys that cost more than my kids' Christmas lists combined. All for the handful of days Owen might visit. And then there were the little things that didn't feel so little. If Ryan called needing help, Mom would drop whatever she was doing, even if she'd promised to pick up Grace from soccer practice or help Lucas with his science project. Your brother's new to parenting, she'd explain, as if my 2 years of single fatherhood somehow didn't count. At family dinners, Owen's babbling was met with coos and laughter, while Lucas's stories about his artwork or Grace's excitement about an upcoming recital were brushed aside with, "That's nice, honey," before the conversation swung back to the baby. It was subtle at first, a more expensive Christmas gift here. A comment about how Owen looked just like Ryan did at that age there. But slowly, the imbalance became impossible to ignore. I tried to be understanding. New babies are exciting. This was my parents' first grandson from Ryan, and I wanted Lucas and Grace to be gracious, to feel proud of their cousin. But I could see it in their eyes, the way they'd glance at me when Grandma left the room to rock Owen. The tight smiles when Grandpa joked about the next little football star while ruffling Owen's hair. One evening, after a long shift, I found Grace sitting on the porch steps, her violin case beside her. "Grandma said I was being too loud," she said quietly. But Owen wasn't even sleeping. Aunt Tiffany just didn't want me practicing in the living room. A week later, Lucas brought home an art ribbon from school, first place in his grade, and when he showed my mother, she barely looked up from scrolling through photos Tiffany had texted of Owen in a pumpkin patch. That's when I started to feel it. Not just the old sibling rivalry, but a gnawing sense that my children were learning something I never wanted them to believe, that in this family, love and attention came with a hierarchy, and they were somewhere near the bottom. By the time Owen was 3 months old, it was crystal clear that my parents had rearranged not just their home, but their entire lives around him. The dining room they'd once used for Thanksgiving dinners now stood as a showroom nursery, soft pastel walls, a $1,200 crib, and a rocking chair so plush it could have come from a designer catalog. They even installed blackout curtains, so the baby could nap comfortably. The irony? Ryan and Tiffany's 4-bedroom colonial was just a 10-minute drive away, fully equipped for a baby. But here at my parents' house, Owen was treated like royalty on a state visit, with accommodations that rivaled a luxury hotel suite. Meanwhile, Lucas and Grace, the only grandchildren my parents had known for over a decade, were expected to stay in their converted office-turned bedroom and keep things down because Owen needs quiet. My kids' toys, which had been neatly kept in their room or a small basket in the living room, were suddenly deemed clutter and boxed up in the garage to make the space more baby-friendly. It didn't stop there. Dinner conversations became monologues about Owen's milestones. "He's already holding his head up," Mom would gush, or "the pediatrician says he's very advanced for his age." Lucas once tried to share that he'd made the honor roll, only to be met with a distracted, "That's nice, buddy," before Dad launched into a story about how Ryan had also been a natural athlete at Owen's age. The double standard was as thick as the humidity in a Charleston summer. Owen could drop his sippy cup on the floor 3 times in a row and have everyone laughing, while Grace was told to mind her manners if she so much as asked for something different too. Eat. If Lucas left his sketchbook on the coffee table, it was messy. If Tiffany left baby gear all over the living room, it was necessary. I really did, to frame it for my kids in a way that wouldn't poison their relationship with their grandparents. New babies take up a lot of attention, I'd say. It doesn't mean you're loved any less. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew they rang hollow on Saturday. The twins and I had planned to bake cookies together. It had been a tough week. I'd worked extra shifts, and the kids had been patient about our limited time together. Just as we got the butter and sugar in the mixing bowl, Mom came in and announced that she needed the kitchen cleared because Tiffany was bringing Owen over and doesn't like the smell of strong food while she's nursing. Grace looked at me with wide, confused eyes. Lucas quietly put the mixing spoon in the sink, and I felt something inside me begin to snap. It wasn't just about cookies or toys or who got the bigger Christmas gift. It was about the message. My children were getting every single day that in this house, they were an afterthought. That evening, I started keeping a mental list. Every time my parents canceled plans with Lucas and Grace to accommodate Ryan's schedule, every time my kids were told to adjust for Owen's comfort but never the other way around, every slight, every oversight, every reminder that in their grandparents' eyes, my children would never be the chosen ones. I didn't know it yet, but that list would eventually push me to make a decision that would change our lives forever. Because love, at least the kind worth having, doesn't come with a ranking system. And I wasn't going to let my kids grow up thinking they had to earn a place in their own family. It started small, a few extra house rules here and there, but within months, it felt like my kids were living under a different set of laws than anyone else in that house. It started small, a few extra house rules here and there, but within months, it felt like my kids were living under a different set of laws than anyone else in that house. The first shift came one Sunday afternoon when Owen was over. Lucas and Grace were in the backyard tossing a football. Wasn't loud, just a few shouts. The sound of the ball hitting their hands, the kind of normal childhood noise any neighborhood in America might hear on a weekend. Mom opened the back door and motioned for them to come in. Owen's down for a nap. She whispered like they were in church. Now you need to find something quiet to do. I glanced through the kitchen window and saw Owen wide awake in Tiffany's arms, gnawing on a teething toy. But my kids, obedient and confused, trudged inside and sat in their room for the rest of the afternoon. Soon it wasn't just noise control. Their toys, which had already been trimmed down to a small corner of the living room, were declared in the way and boxed up in the garage. Grace's violin practice was relegated to whatever sliver of time Tiffany didn't need the living room for her work calls. Lucas, who loved to spread out his sketchbooks on the coffee table, was told to keep everything in his room because it makes the place look messy. Meanwhile, Owen's bouncer, playmat, and half a dozen toy bins took up prime real estate. In the center of the living room, like a permanent exhibit, the television, which my kids were allowed to watch for an hour after school, was now permanently tuned to Tiffany's shows, daytime talk programs, renovation series because it's what Owen likes to have on in the background. When I suggested switching to something the twins could enjoy, I was met with, they can watch TV in their room. A generous offer, considering their room was still the converted office. Barely large enough for 2 twin beds and a dresser. The part that cut deepest wasn't just the rules. It was the double standard. Owen could scatter Cheerios across the entire kitchen floor, and my parents would chuckle. He's just exploring. But if Lucas left his shoes by the door, Dad would bark, "Pick up after yourself." It wasn't lost on my kids. One evening at dinner, Lucas leaned over and whispered, "How come Owen can make a mess, and it's funny, but we get in trouble?" I didn't have a good answer. All I could do was tell him, "I see it too, and it's not fair." I tried to address it with my parents gently. One night after the twins were in bed, I told them they're starting to feel like they're being singled out. It's hurting them. Dad waved me off. They're just being sensitive. Babies need more attention. I pointed out that Owen spent most days at daycare and that my kids weren't asking for attention during those hours. Mom just sighed. "Michael, you've always been jealous of your brother. Don't pass that on to your children." It was like talking to a brick wall, so I bit my tongue. I needed their roof over our heads a little while longer, and I was still scraping together savings for a place of our own. But every rule they piled on, every reminder that my kids were guests, while Ryan's family were honored residents, made me more certain we couldn't stay forever. The tipping point came one weekday afternoon. Grace had an important virtual rehearsal for an upcoming violin recital. She'd been looking forward to it for weeks. She set up in the living room, the only space with the right acoustics, just as Tiffany breezed in, baby on hip, and said, "Not right now. Owen's napping, and I've got a Zoom call in 10 minutes. Grace offered to play softly, but Tiffany cut her off. "Find another time. My calls and Owen's schedule come first." Grace quietly packed away her violin. But that night I found her crying in her room. "It's like nothing we do matters here," she said. And she was right. It wasn't one single moment that broke my heart. It was the slow, steady erosion I could see in my kids every day. Lucas, my bright, creative boy who used to chatter about his art projects all the way home from school, was going quiet. His teachers emailed to say he seemed distracted, less engaged in class. One even asked gently if something had changed at home. I knew exactly what had changed. Home had stopped feeling like a place where he could breathe. Grace, my spirited girl who could once light up a room with her confidence, was starting to shrink into herself. She practiced her violin less, and less not because she didn't want to, but because she didn't want to bother anyone. The joy she used to have when learning a new piece was replaced with the cautious look of someone asking for its permission to exist. It was in the little things they stopped bringing their friends over. They'd spend more time in the cramped, converted office than anywhere else in the house, whispering to each other even when Owen wasn't there. When I asked why, Lucas said, "Grandma and Grandpa always seem annoyed when we're in the living room." Grace nodded and added, "It's like they'd rather we just stayed out of sight." I'd catch them glancing toward the door whenever they laughed too loudly, as if waiting for someone to tell them to quiet down. And I hated, absolutely hated, that they were learning to measure themselves by how little space they took up. One night after work, I found Lucas sitting cross-legged on his bed, sketching in the dim light of his bedside lamp. "What are you drawing, buddy?" I asked. He shrugged and turned the notebook around. It was a picture of a small house with a big yard, the kind we'd seen on our drives to school. "This is where we could live someday," he said simply. "It's just us. No one telling us we're too loud." That one hit me in the gut. It wasn't just about unfair rules anymore. It was about the messages they were absorbing. The sun that was slowly being chipped away. I'd lived with my parents' favoritism my whole life, but I'd developed a thick skin. My kids, they were still forming who they were in this world. And if we stayed much longer, that world was going too. Tell them they were second-class citizens in their own family. The financial reality was still there, pressing down on me. Rent in Charleston wasn't cheap, and between working long shifts in the ER and paying for every one of my kids' needs myself, the savings were coming slowly. But each time I saw them retreat further into themselves, I added another reason to the list of why we had to get out, and soon, even the rare good moments were shadowed by the imbalance. When my mom took Grace shopping for a school outfit, it was because Tiffany had called to say Owen needed new clothes and Mom just happened to let Grace tag along. When Dad watched Lucas play soccer, it was only because Ryan and Tiffany had brought Owen to the same park that day. They weren't being included because they mattered. They were being included because it was convenient. That's the kind of love that leaves bruises you can't see. Knew I couldn't just pack up and leave without a plan, not with kids depending on me. But I also knew this couldn't drag on much longer. I started taking extra shifts, not just for the paycheck, but to avoid the constant undercurrent of tension at home. The more time I spent away, the clearer my perspective became. One afternoon, while grabbing coffee at the hospital break room, a colleague named Nancy asked if everything was okay. She'd noticed I seemed tighter lately. I told her the truth, all of it. She listened, really listened, before saying something that stopped me cold. "Michael, it sounds like your brother's family are the honored guests in that house. And you and your kids are the tenants nobody wanted." She was right. And saying it out loud made the decision that had been building inside me feel inevitable. This wasn't just a rough patch. This was an environment that was telling my kids, day after day, that they mattered less. And as their father, I couldn't let that be their normal. It happened on a Tuesday in mid-October, one of those long, untired days in the ER, where you're running from room to room, doing triage, making split-second calls, barely remembering to drink water. By the time I finally glanced at my phone during a quick lunch break, I saw 4 missed texts from Lucas and 3 from Grace. From Lucas's dad, "Something weird is happening." From Grace, "Grandma says we have to move to the basement. This is not fair." From Lucas, "Please come home. They took all our stuff downstairs." From Grace, "It's cold down here, and there are spiders." My stomach turned. I called both of them. No answer. Called the house. Nothing. I texted Grace back, "I'm leaving. Work as soon as I can. Stay calm. I love you both." I told my charge nurse I had a family emergency. She didn't ask questions, just told me to hand off my patients and go. It still took me an hour to finish critical documentation and arrange coverage. The drive home felt endless. When I walked through the front door, Lucas and Grace were huddled together on the couch, eyes red from crying. My mom was in the kitchen with Tiffany, sipping tea like it was any other afternoon. My dad and Ryan were nowhere in sight. "What's going on?" I asked, heading straight for my kids. Grace stood and hugged me so tightly it hurt. "They moved all our stuff to the basement without asking," she said. "They said we don't deserve the good rooms upstairs." I walked into the kitchen. "Why are my kids' belongings in the basement?" I asked, keeping my voice level. Tiffany didn't look up from her mug. "We needed the space for Owen's nursery and my home office," she said casually. Kids are older. They can adapt. I stared at her, then at my mother, who was looking me square in the eye. It's the logical solution, she said. Owen is here all day. Your kids are at school. Our other grandson deserves the best rooms. Last line hit like a slap. I reminded them that the basement was damp, cold, and had visible mold, a health risk for Lucas's asthma. My father, who had just walked in with Ryan, waved me off. I put down some carpet scraps and extra lights. It's fine. They should. Be grateful they have a place to stay at all. Something in me went still. All the years of being the dependable one. The one who didn't need help. The one who'd swallow his pride for the sake of peace. They collapsed into a single, clear thought. I'm done. I turned back to Lucas and Grace. Go pack your most important things, I told them gently. We'll come back for the rest later. Dad stepped forward. Stop being dramatic, Michael. No one's asking you to leave. I smiled, not out of humor, but because I'd already made my choice. You just made it very clear where we stand in this family, and we deserve better. Ryan tried to smooth things over, suggesting we talk about this rationally. Tiffany scoffed, calling it just a bedroom rearrangement. Mom insisted the basement was perfectly adequate, and accused me of overreacting. I didn't argue, didn't raise my voice. I just kept telling my kids to get their backpacks. Within minutes, Lucas came down holding his sketchbooks and the stuffed dragon he'd had since he was 3. Grace had her violin case and a small bag of clothes. They were quiet, but their eyes told me they understood exactly what was happening. We walked out together. My parents stood on the porch, alternating between anger and disbelief. My mother called after me, "If you leave, don't expect to be welcome back." I turned to her. I stopped expecting that a long time ago. We got in the car, and as I pulled away, I caught sight of Lucas and Grace in the rearview mirror. They weren't looking back at the house with sadness. They looked relieved. By the time we hit the first stoplight, I knew there was no going back. My hands were steady on the wheel, but inside, I felt the kind of clarity you only get in moments that truly change you. For years, I'd tried to make things work under my parents' roof, biting my tongue, making compromises, telling myself the peace was worth the cost. But after that basement stunt, there was nothing left to salvage. Lucas broke the silence first. "Dad, are we really leaving for good?" His voice was cautious, like he wasn't sure if it was okay to hope. "Yeah," I said, looking at him in the mirror. "We're done living somewhere. We're treated like second-class citizens. We deserve better than that." Grace sat up a little straighter in the back seat, clutching her violin case. "Even if Grandma and Grandpa get mad?" she asked. "Even then," I told her. "Sometimes doing what's right means disappointing people, even family." It weren't headed to some glamorous escape. My plan had always been to move us into the small rental I'd quietly secured a few weeks earlier, but it wasn't available until the first of the month. In the meantime, we'd stay with Nancy, the coworker who'd listened to me vent in the hospital break room and offered her guest room without hesitation. She had even set up an air mattress for the kids so they could sleep side by side. Pulling into Nancy's driveway felt like pulling into safe harbor. She came out to meet us, wrapping Grace in a gentle hug and clapping Lucas on the shoulder before turning to me. "You did the right thing," she said. "You can breathe here." That night, the kids unpacked their essentials in the cozy guest room. We ordered pizza and ate in the living room while watching an old comedy on TV. I don't think I'd heard Lucas laugh like that in months. Grace stretched out on the couch without a single she, the baby sleeping to shut her down the next morning. I drove them to school from Nancy's. Before they got out of the car, I told them, "Listen, I know the last couple of years haven't been easy, but this is the start of something better. I promise you." Grace smiled for the first time in days. Lucas gave me a thumbs dash up. Later that afternoon, I called my parents to let them know I'd be coming by too. "Get the rest of our things." My father's voice was tight. "Michael, you're making a mistake. We've given you a place to stay for nearly 2 years. That's not nothing, I know," I said. "And I'm grateful for the help. But help that comes with strings attached, that costs my kids their dignity isn't help we can keep accepting. My mother jumped in. This is about Steven, isn't it? You've always been jealous? I didn't take the bait. This is about Lucas and Grace being told they don't deserve the same comfort or respect as their cousin. I won't raise them in a house where that's considered acceptable. The line went quiet. Finally, Dad said, "Do what you have to do. But don't expect us to be happy about it." I hung up knowing exactly what that meant. More cold shoulders, more guilt. Trips at family gatherings. But I also knew I could live with that. What I couldn't live with was my kids thinking their worth depended on their place in someone else's pecking order. That evening, as the sun dipped low over Charleston, I sat on Nancy's porch watching Lucas draw in his sketchbook and Grace practice a new violin piece. The sound carried across the yard, free and unbothered. And for the first time in a long time, I realized something. The peace I'd been trying to keep back at my parents' house wasn't real peace at all. We were out. We were free. In just a few short weeks, we'd be home. First morning, we woke up at Nancy's. I felt a weight off my chest I hadn't realized I was carrying. There was no tension in the air, no sound of passive-aggressive footsteps in the hallway, no fear that someone was going to come knocking on the door with yet another house rule. Lucas padded into the kitchen in his socks, hair a mess, and poured himself a bowl of cereal without being told to keep his voice down. Grace followed with her violin case, setting it gently on the counter before grabbing a banana. For a week, we lived out of our bags at Nancy's. She gave us space, but also made it clear we were welcome, a balance my parents never quite managed. In the evenings, we'd eat simple dinners together. Then Lucas would sprawl on the living room floor sketching, while Grace practiced softly in the corner. Nancy would smile and say, "This house has been too quiet for too long." When November 1st finally rolled around, I met the landlord at our new rental, a small, 3-bedroom brick home in a quiet Charleston neighborhood. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours. Front porch just big enough for 2 chairs, a fenced backyard for the kids to run around in, and a kitchen with more natural light than I'd dared hope for. The kids didn't care that the living room walls needed a fresh coat of paint, or that the carpet in the hallway was worn. To them, it was freedom. Grace picked her bedroom instantly, claiming the one with the bigger window so she could practice with sunlight streaming in. Lucas wanted the smaller room, but with a built-in shelf for his art supplies. I took the master not because I cared about having the bigger space, but because I wanted them to have their own rooms after years of sharing that cramped converted office. We'd been smart about the move. I'd ordered a few key pieces of furniture. To be delivered that morning: beds, a sofa, a dining table. Friends from the hospital came by to help unload boxes. Nancy brought lunch and stayed to help Grace unpack her clothes, while Lucas and I set up his desk by nightfall. We had a working kitchen, beds made with clean sheets, and enough of the living room cleared to sit together and eat pizza on the floor. Lucas fell asleep that night with his sketchbook beside him, the lamp still on. Grace left her violin out on its stand, ready for the morning. The change in them was immediate. Lucas's shoulders seemed to lift. He was talking more, sharing details about school and his friends again. Grace was practicing daily, her bow gliding, with confidence I hadn't heard in months. They weren't whispering anymore. They laughed, loud, unrestrained, the kind of laugh you can only have when you're not waiting for someone to tell you to stop. Even I noticed a difference in myself. My shifts at the hospital felt less draining because I wasn't going home to walk on eggshells. I could come in the door, drop my keys on the counter, and be greeted by the sound of my kids living their lives without fear of judgment. A week later, Grace asked, "Dad, can we have friends over now?" My answer was immediate: of course. That Saturday, she had 2 classmates over for a movie, and Lucas hosted a drawing club with a couple of kids from school. Hearing the house full of laughter and footsteps was like oxygen. We still saw my parents cautiously. I wasn't cutting them off, but visits were on our terms. No more dropping by their house only to be made to feel like intruders. No more situations where my kids were told they had to bend themselves to fit someone else's comfort. One evening, As I stood on our little porch watching Lucas shoot hoops in the driveway and Grace braid a friend's hair, Nancy stopped by to drop off some mail that had come to her house. She took one look around and said, "Michael, this place fits you." She was right. It did. Not because it was perfect, but because it was ours. A place where my kids could finally grow. Without the weight of favoritism hanging over them, I knew then that leaving my parents' house hadn't just been the right move. It had been the only move. It didn't take long for the ripples to reach my parents' house. Within a month of us moving out, the calls started, not from Ryan, of course. I didn't need to imagine why. Without me there to handle most of the cooking, cleaning, and grocery runs, and without my kids pitching in with small chores, my parents were doing it all themselves. And with Ryan and Tiffany still camped out, during their never-ending home renovation, that was no small task. The first real crack showed at a Sunday dinner about 6 weeks after we left. We'd agreed to come over, partly because I wanted the kids to maintain some connection with their grandparents, and partly because I was curious to see the lay of the land. Walking in, I noticed right away the house looked cluttered. Toys, baby gear, and unopened boxes crowded the living room. My mom's usually spotless kitchen had dishes piled in the sink. Tiffany was at the table scrolling through her phone while my mom stirred a pot at the stove. One hip cocked and fatigued. Dinner was civil, but the energy had shifted. Ryan wasn't as smug as usual, and Tiffany seemed distracted, almost irritated. When the meal ended, my mom asked Grace if she could help clear the table, something she'd never asked when my kids lived there full time, because I was the one who did it. Lucas jumped in to help without complaint, but I caught my mom's grateful glance, and it told me more than words could. A week later, my Aunt Susan stopped by our new place with a plate of cookies and a bit of gossip. "Your mom is worn out," she said. "She's been chasing that baby all day and trying to keep the house in order, and Tiffany's not exactly stepping up." Susan lowered her voice. "Between you and me, I think Ryan and Tiffany depended on you a lot more than they realized." It made sense. While we'd been living there, I had kept my head down and my kids respectful. We didn't make messes we couldn't clean up, and I made sure the house stayed in order. Without that, all the extra noise, clutter, and disruption fell squarely on my parents, and they were in their mid-60s now. By Christmas, I heard from Susan again that the golden veneer was wearing thin. Ryan and Tiffany were arguing about money, about the stalled renovation, about childcare. My mom had admitted to Susan that she'd underestimated how much I'd been doing, and even my father, who rarely admitted to misjudgment, had apparently muttered that things were easier when Michael was here. We still came to Sunday dinner once or twice a month, but now it was on my terms. I arrived with a dish to share, stayed for a polite visit, and left when I was ready. There were no lectures about my parenting, no unsolicited comparisons to Owen. If they slipped into old habits, I shut it down with a look or a change of subject. The kids noticed the change too. Lucas mentioned after one dinner Grandma didn't tell us to be quiet once. Grace added, and Grandpa actually asked about my recital. Small steps, but meaningful ones. The truth is, the balance had shifted.